And the RSF now is like the formalized Janjaweed.
So Bashir formalized it now.
Yes.
So before it was
official but unofficial.
Yeah, official but unofficial. I don't want to officialize you guys
Yeah.
yet, but now I want to officialize it. So he kind of rebranded it into the Rapid Support Forces.
Exactly.
Damn.
The South Sudan War from 1983 all the way until, let's say, the ceasefire in 2002, 2 million people dead. And then you had the Darfur War in 2003. That's also 300,000, 400,000 dead. So also the bigger question by the time it was 2011, like how long will we have a genocidal government? You have to think about the numbers also. The South Sudan War from 1983 all the way until, let's say, the ceasefire in 2002, 2 million people dead.
Wow.
And then you had the Darfur War in 2003. That's also 300,000, 400,000 dead.
Wow.
So also the bigger question by the time it was 2011, like how long will we have a genocidal government? That instead of doing a peace deal with the Darfur groups, just like they did with the South Sudan groups, bring in the Janjaweed. Bring in the Janjaweed, which then, like, that is the main ingredient to the destruction that we have right now.
So before we proceed after 2011, explain the Darfur War in 2003.
Okay.
Yeah.
So historically, we talked about like the savannah and the desert, the forest or the jungle and the desert. There was always a relationship across Africa.
Okay.
Between kind of pastoralist groups. These pastoralist groups can be either Fulani, Tawarig, Tabbu. They can be a lot of different groups over there. People call them Arabs out of just like intellectual laziness. Like, the guy has a turban, he must be an Arab.
Yeah.
But there are different groups with different languages and stuff like that. But there's a common trait of having pastoralist groups seasonally moving southward for grazing lands. Okay. When you start seeing just the colors, the green and that,
yeah.
This is all across Africa. Historically, there wasn't an issue because this green line was higher. There's a desertification that happened through time. And the pastoralists had to go further south into the grazing lands. Now, with the extreme droughts that happened, especially in the 70s and in the 80s, you started seeing a lot of groups having to move further south. And now it's starting to interrupt agricultural lands.
Okay.
So in the past, they used to just find grazing lands that weren't actively used as agriculture. But now they're moving into agricultural lands. And this is where the problems started getting really bad. And to add to that, you probably heard about the Toyota Wars in Chad, which is basically in the 80s between different groups in Chad. And this created a huge migration. A lot of people fled that war and they came into Sudan.
Okay.
The Hemmetis, the Dagalus, and these guys came from these areas into Sudan because it was always like, okay, you can go Sudan as far as the Nile and then you're in very fertile areas. But even if you go to Darfur, you have Jabal Marra over here, very green, a lot of vegetation and stuff like that. So historically, there wasn't a problem with resources when they started coming in. But then little by little with the wars in Chad and the wars in Libya and stuff, you started getting more and more of these pastoralist groups coming into Sudan. Now, if you're a government and you have a problem where you have a lot of pastoralists coming into the country and out of necessity, the logical thing is to start doing, development projects. Start digging more wells, finding out how you can irrigate more land. Like, this is a material problem. The problem is the ideology, the Islamo-Arab ideology started seeing this as an opportunity rather than as a tragedy. Because there's always been discontent within Darfur, within the indigenous groups of Darfur, of saying like, guys, this Islamo-Arab ideology is putting us as second-class citizens. So it's not something we ascribe to or anything. And because also it was kind of the reverse of what Khartoum was trying to do. The indigenous groups of Darfur were the educated ones. Almost half of the engineering faculties in the University of Khartoum were from Darfur. They saw the pastoralist groups as groups that are uneducated, they're marginalized, they're this, so we'll let them kind of stay on the margins. But then when the discontent started happening, there was a revolution in 1985 that removed Nimeri. We forgot to talk about that earlier.
So 85 is called?
85, April 1985, there was a revolution that removed Nimeri.
Okay.
From power.
And who took over after Nimeri?
There was elections.
Oh, okay.
There was elections, and Sadiq al-Mahdi, he's the grandson of the Mahdi who defeated the British. So he was elected president.
Okay.
And during that time, like I said, you had a lot of migration of these pastoralist groups. So once the discontent started in Darfur, it was first civil discontent. There were like non-violent movements, Sunni and the Red Sun and like a lot of these movements that actually expressed the idea that, guys, the potential of Darfur is huge. Like Niala is the second biggest city in Sudan. The amount of livestock and agriculture and mining capabilities, gold, copper, all of these things, gum Arabic. Darfur should be the wealthiest state in Sudan. Instead, impoverished. Instead, it was neglected, underdeveloped. And then you started seeing attempts at demographic change. The elite in Khartoum were trying to empower these pastoralist groups because they're fellow Arabs, quote unquote again. So this is where you started getting the problems compounding. There's more and more discontent, more and more clashes between farmers and pastoralists. This isn't a new dynamic. Even during the South Sudan War, and this was the original sin, before 2003, when Nimeri and Bashir were fighting the SPLM in the South, they actually armed the pastoralist tribes that are on the border with the South. They armed them so that they can go and fight South Sudanese and take over grazing lands at the same time. So the idea of the Janjaweed is older than the Janjaweed themselves. It started in the late 70s and early 80s. The problem is, Gaddafi, God bless his heart, but he did some terrible atrocities back in the days.
Gaddafi?
Yeah.
Okay.
He turned a new leaf, so people don't like to mention this, but he had an Arab alliance in Libya, where he saw different Arab tribes in Libya as supposedly they're supposed to have kind of to oversee the Sahel region. And these were ruthless, like basically Janjaweed types. So he went to war with like the people of northern Chad and southern Chad, like the Quran, the Tabbu, and these guys. Like he went to war against them as well. But a lot of these groups started coming into Sudan.
Okay.
So you started getting the ethnic extremism, the ethnic, superiority of the quote unquote Arab.
Arabized Africans
Yes.
versus the non-Arabized Africans. So you mean to
and
tell
there was
me,
a religious aspect to it.
okay.
As well.
So you mean to tell me this is I didn't know this. So you mean to tell me that Gaddafi had a hand in the formation of the Janjaweed?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
But he realized this later.
Okay.
Like later, once he started switching to a Pan-African view,
Yeah.
Gaddafi was a little unstable. He was an unstable guy. So like people shouldn't look at, what he does. The general sentiment of a sovereign Libya and stuff like that, people are with it.
Okay.
But this idea of getting militias and Arab militias and stuff like that is the stuff that actually started messing with the order of things and started messing with the sovereignty of nations. He definitely then started backing away from that.
Mm-hmm.
But during that time, it was one of the elements that actually helped in, exasperating this problem of Arabized militias, compounded by the problems of desertification and, the famines, in the 80s and stuff like that. There were famines that were happening in Sudan.
Mm-hmm.
So it was kind of like the perfect storm that started leading little by little into what became the Darfur War.
Okay.
But only after like the 90s period and seeing that like Bashir and these guys are not backing down
Mm-hmm.
and they're going full speed ahead, that's when the Darfur rebellion started.
So let's talk about it now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in 2002, the Sudan Liberation Movement started, which was basically groups from Darfur who saw kind of this supremacy ideology that Khartoum is doing and the attempted demographic change from that. Because remember, like this started from the 80s. You started getting a lot of pastoralist groups being displaced into Sudan and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
So once the rebellion started, they doubled down. Bashir and his whole government, they doubled down. Even Burhan right now, who's like, the head of SAF, he was stationed in Darfur back then.
Oh, really?
Yes, indeed.
No, I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So once he started getting the rebellion and, people, the Khartoum started, the logical thing was to do, it was in 2003. You already started negotiating with South Sudan. The logical thing to do was to then add Darfur into the comprehensive peace agreement. If somebody rebels out of either marginalization or repression or something like that, they have a cause. There's a reason why they picked up the arms. Sitting down with that person and finding out why they picked up the arms is the thing that could have avoided the 500,000 people who were killed through the Darfur War. But they chose war.
Okay.
Bashir, his National Congress Party, chose to arm the Janjaweed. And he knows that once you bring, some nomadic groups that, the desert life is something that's very harsh.
It's harsh, yeah.
Even defending yourself and stuff like that. So there's already this idea that you can't even go anywhere across the desert without a weapon. Okay. So it's that kind of thing. Then because they also, Khartoum started doing propaganda, started telling Arabized groups in Darfur that these black Darfurians want to get rid of all Arabs.
So propaganda. Propaganda is always the foundation of every war.
Absolutely.
And of every conflict, of every disagreement, basically, it's propaganda.
Yes.
Okay.
So
wait, just a bit, Mosaab. As a president, Bashir, why did he want to support the Janjaweed?
Because there's the older issue of the arming the Arabized tribes against the South Sudanese. There's already a precedence for this.
I get you.
There's already a precedence that there's the racial undertone to it, is that these black people in Darfur and in South Sudan and in the Nuba Mountains, they want to come and kill you Arabs.
I get it. Oh, okay.
This is something that, again, like that cancer that was installed during the Ottoman period, that's the cancer that still continued. And these guys are just like newer cancer cells that are just as malignant, but with new tools and new propaganda.
Okay. Oof.
So for him, it was a way to crush the rebellion in Darfur. The problem is, when you think about groups like, Hemeti's group and, other groups that are nomadic across the desert, it's almost like there's an open ground for recruitment that goes from Darfur through Chad, through Niger, through Mali to Mauritania. Specific tribes that are actually scattered throughout that area. But once there's a call to war, you'll get recruits from these countries coming into Sudan.
Damn.
That's why one of the first things about Sudan is to, the war that's happening right now is not to think of it as a war within the borders of Sudan. Physically, it might be in the borders of Sudan, but realistically, it actually extends to all of these areas. Let me give you another nugget. The war started off in Khartoum in April 2023.
This current war now.
Yeah.
Okay.
At the time, the president in Niger was Mohamed Bazoum. When Bazoum won the election in 2021 or 2022, Hemeti traveled to congratulate Mohamed Bazoum because they have some kind of tribal relationship. War broke out in April. In July, Niger did their coup, removed Mohamed Bazoum.
Chiani
came in, and they created the AES in July of that year.
Okay, interesting.
Part of it is also seeing the chaos from the RSF over here and saying, wait a minute, these guys, the RSF, the Janjaweed, are recruiting from Chad and from Niger and from Mali. There is no way we're going to let an RSF or a Janjaweed rule in the AES, rule in Niger, just like they're ruling in Sudan. Hemeti was in power from 2019 to before the war. He was basically running Sudan.
And Burhan was behind him, or
no? Burhan was technically his senior.
His senior, but he was letting Hemeti run the whole thing. So it's like almost like the prime minister.
Yeah.
And Burhan the president.
Yeah.
Okay.
But go back to the Darfur War. So the Darfur War was kind of the devastation that happened also during the Darfur War was huge. I mean, to the point where, even before this war, before 2023, there were 3 million people still displaced
from the
from the 2003 war, and the war, because it never stopped. Basically, there was never a deal that stopped the Darfur War completely. So from 2003, until 2023, you had like millions of people displaced internally and externally outside of Sudan. This was also one of the things that it was almost like the last episode of a naked and genocidal war by that government where people didn't know about it. During the South Sudan war days, people didn't really know what was going on in South Sudan. There wasn't any reporting out of there. It was, you just get like Amnesty International and like Human Rights Watch and these guys putting out reports and stuff. But even the internet, like you couldn't get a lot of information during those days. But the Darfur War, then you started getting and the difference also, like, there's, other than the time period, Darfur has a huge legacy, long legacy of civic action as well. The amount of Darfur activists and students and, was huge in Sudan and in the diaspora. But it was a time where, like, one of the most important factors that led to 2019 and removing Bashir was the student movement in Sudan, for example. There's a long legacy of student movement in Sudan. Like in 1964, they removed Aboud. It was mainly student activists. In 1985, also, a huge part of that revolution was also student activists. Throughout the 2000s, the university campuses in Sudan, especially the ones in Khartoum, almost like war zones. Because you have the Bashir students going up against a huge block of opposition students. Unfortunately, the Bashir students would a lot of times incorporate national security, militias, like the public defense forces, and these guys to come in and, like, go to war with the students. But the Darfur students were there also. So were the South Sudanese students. So there's a legacy of, if I'm a student from Darfur, I'm coming to university in Khartoum, I'm going to sit down with the students from other parts of Sudan and tell them exactly what's going on over there.
Okay.
So there was a knowledge transfer among the students, and that created a huge student movement.
Wow.
Even the SPLM, like them and other groups, like they had the African National Front, which was a huge student body in universities in Sudan. So that's where the Darfur War took a different turn, where there was more engagement with the people who were actually affected by the war. And that's where you started getting, little by little, the civic resistance that was there in 1985.
Yeah.
In the 2000s, it started to regroup again. It was there in the 90s, but in the 2000s, it started blossoming a little bit more.
That's when it started boiling up.
Yes, exactly.
And the Janjaweed means devil in a horse, huh?
Yes.
Why the name? Why devil in a horse? What's the significance of that name?
It's hard to tell where the name actually came from.
Okay.
But it started becoming, a kind of a metaphor for the ruthlessness of the Janjaweed. If you want to go back to the Janjaweed, like, we're not talking about, like, Arabized tribes that are in Darfur or Arabized tribes in Chad as groups. The Janjaweed came out of banditry. Because when you look at the map, these are huge, vast areas. So the trade routes were the main vulnerability because of the banditry. Like I said, like, since the 70s and 80s, with these droughts and famines that happened along the Sahel region, you started getting, like, banditry as a way of life, just for food and sustenance, where you have communities that have been completely impoverished and they had to sell all their cattle and there's really nothing left. As a young person, you already have your horse or your camel and you have an AK-47. Time to go get some food.
Wow.
The conditions that exist in that region of the Sahel are conditions that probably the most harshest conditions on the continent, if not in the world. As far as how arid it is, as far as how much desertification happened, as far as how it's been neglected for so long, all of these factors led to a situation, and you had more than enough warlords willing to recruit these bandits. So it's a progression of underdevelopment, of desertification, of all of these issues that then becomes an issue of just basic sustenance and basic nutrition, being able to get food and being able to put a roof on your head, like all those basic necessities started to become very scarce and gone.
Wow.
So the banditry become a means of survival.
Mm-hmm.
Like it wasn't even like, you know, a group, a specific group.
Mm.
It was something that was known that if you're in a caravan traveling, taking some, you know, livestock or something across borders, you're carrying some goods, commercial goods to go and sell in the market in Niala or going to N'Djamena in Chad,
Mm-hmm.
you had to have protection. You know, it literally the wild, wild west
Damn.
in that area. But that's the whole reason why you're supposed to have governments to solve the problems, these kind of problems that lead into conflict. Instead of them looking at like trying to solve these issues
Mm-hmm.
and trying to development, digging wells,
Mm-hmm.
like all of these things, you know, reforesting areas, like, it was, you know, basically the exact opposite of I have a rebellion, so let me use these guys as my army
Mm-hmm.
and we'll pay them.
Mm-hmm.
And it worked.
Wow.
It worked, and he started, you know, first recruiting the groups that are in Darfur, and then those groups started bringing groups from outside of Darfur. So that's where it started to become a militia state. You know, we've done a lot of research about the idea of turning the country into a militia state, into the idea of, you know, bounty and, you know, loot being the method of payment. That's also another thing. It's like they're bandits anyway. So, you know, we don't have any salaries for you. But whatever you take from those villages, that's yours.
Mm.
You know, so it became a mode of operation.
Damn.
It's like you're creating a monster. You know, this is from the 70s through the 80s, intensified in 2003 with the Darfur rebellion.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So then it started to get out of their control.
Uh-huh.
The Janjaweed started becoming a force that they can't control
Mm-hmm.
anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Started seeing divisions, different Janjaweed leaders, like taking different sides and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
By the time South Sudan got its independence, then that alliance I was telling you about earlier,
Yes.
about all the liberation movements
Mhm.
getting together,
Mhm.
that's when he created the RSF. And the RSF now is like the formalized Janjaweed.
So Bashir formalized it now.
Yes.
So before it was an outsider movement. You guys, I'll support you and everything, but I don't
official
want to,
but unofficial.
yeah, official but unofficial. I don't want to officialize you guys
Yeah.
yet, but now I want to officialize you. So he
Yes.
kind of rebranded it into the Rapid Support Forces.
Exactly.
Damn. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Go on.
Once it became the Rapid Support Forces in 2013, from there, then you start like seeing that decline that led to the war. Because then in 2013, and it was like, okay, you know, the RSF, people would ask questions like, is this RSF part of the army? Is it part of national security? Like, what the hell is going on? Like, who are
what is
these
this?
guys? Yeah. The problem is when we think that it wasn't just Bashir thinking like, I'll get the RSF and get them on my side. Because the RSF then became internationalized. In 2015, the European Union did a deal with Bashir. Basically, they called it the Khartoum process, where they wanted to work with Sudan so that Sudan can help in reducing the migration into Europe. Because everybody from the Horn of Africa, from Somalia, well, not from, but, you know, Ethiopia, Eritrea, all of these countries, they go through Sudan, then through Libya, into Europe. Whenever you see migrants, like on boats and stuff going
Through the
into Europe,
Mediterranean.
there's a huge possibility a lot of them either came through Sudan or through Niger or some, but they definitely went through Libya as being the main place. So by the time the RSF was created, Bashir almost 100% gave the signal to the West that he wants to become their friend. He wants to improve the relationships through the Gulf Arab countries. So he saw himself as going through the Gulf Arab countries to gain legitimacy from the West, to alleviate the sanctions, and to do these things. I think at some point they wanted to test him to see if he's really loyal to their program or not. So Bashir actually bragged about helping the Qataris remove Gaddafi in Libya. So once the Arab Spring happened in 2011,
that was interesting.
that was a huge scare for Bashir because Hosni Mubarak is gone. Bashar al-Assad is in trouble. Ali Abdullah Saleh was removed from Yemen. The area was going through change. So he knew he was on the chopping block when it came to removing countries that are regime change countries within the Arab Spring. Some of the movements in the Arab Spring were 100% organic. Tunisia, Egypt, even Syria in the very, very beginning when there was protests, Yemen, but empire won't leave the fate of these countries to be determined by their people at all. So the intervention started. And that's when they started supporting armed resistance in Syria, which ultimately became ISIS. And of course, there was Libya. Gaddafi. By that time, Gaddafi, all of that stuff about Arab militias and the Arab alliance and stuff like that, he went away with that. He let that go. He, turned more towards Africa and stuff like that. But his removal was actually the event that destabilized the entire region.
Including Sudan?
Including Sudan.
Okay.
All of the chaos that you see, because the thing is, even, the amount of movement that the RSF now has within Libya and has historically had since Gaddafi was removed was one of the reasons why the RSF, Bashir was able to create the RSF and why the RSF grew so much. Because Gaddafi then became a barrier to that kind of, absolute chaos that comes from these kind of militias. But Bashir actually helped the Qataris and the UAE and these countries remove Gaddafi.
Oh, really?
Yeah, man. So he actually helped them remove Gaddafi, and he actually bragged about it after that.
Oh.
This, of course, then creating the RSF, and then from there, the European Union supported Khartoum to pay the RSF to guard the borders. So they actually funded Hemeti and the RSF.
The European Union.
Yeah.
The same one that is saying, we need to bring peace to Sudan. These guys, man.
We started making noise about that at that time. The European Union, they're funding the RSF and stuff like that. And the European Union was like, no, we don't fund the RSF. We don't send them money. There's no paper trail of money. As soon as they say paper trail, that's when there's something that you need to dig into a little bit more. But we didn't have to do any digging. Hemeti got on TV and he basically said, hey, these cars and these trucks from the EU are not enough. We need more. You guys need to pressure the EU to send us more materials.
Damn, man.
And then we're like, what's this?
Damn.
The European Union and the Europeans are still in denial. No, we don't send them anything and everything. Then Hemeti got on TV a second time. It was basically saying that if you, European Union, if you don't, recognize our effort and recognize us as the RSF doing this, we have a different plan. Basically, probably telling them that we're going to send even more migrants your way. So it was like, okay, this is insane. But the biggest and most damaging thing that happened that blew up the RSF to where it is right now and becoming this huge force was the war in Yemen. So once the Ansar Allah, the Houthis, started their movement, you know, locally, the Yemeni government that was supported by Saudi Arabia didn't have an answer for them. Saudi Arabia and UAE don't have like armies that can actually go in and deal with an issue like that. So they recruited the RSF and SAF to go and fight.
And
yeah,
so you normally hear the RSF. We don't hear the SAF part. We don't hear the SAF when it comes to the Yemen war. Yeah,
same government. The Yemen war, the SAF were more of the higher ranking officers. But the RSF, like there would be planes leaving from Niala in Darfur, carrying hundreds of recruits. And like we've done some investigations. It seems like some of them are like under 18 as well.
Yeah, child soldiers,
but
man.
I'm telling you, man, like the Yemen war and using the RSF in the Yemen war brought the RSF so much money. Like, can you imagine if you're a young person in Darfur, somebody comes and tells you, go and fight in Yemen for 6 months and you'll get like $30,000. You know, that's a lot of money. That's a lot of money to be made. So it became an economy on its own.
It's like 4 million Kenya shillings.
Yeah.
Damn.
Yeah. So the idea then became that this is going to lead to a disaster. Because you have all of these recruits going to Yemen and coming back. You have even tribal leaders from RSF, within RSF, complaining, saying that these recruits, they go to Yemen and they come back. And with that money, they get like motorcycles and an AK and they start robbing people. So you haven't even trained the person to be a soldier and to understand that, you know, criminality is the enemy. It's the exact opposite. You were recruiting basically the future Janjaweed that would come through this war and inflict all this chaos. All of this is right under the command of al-Bashir, and the entire SAF were there supporting the RSF in this.
Wow.
Things have changed right now, but when it comes to tracing back how this war started, like you know, the history, you really have to go back and look at like what is the DNA of this government that would allow something like the RSF to blossom like that and to grow exponentially and to have all this power. So it's you know, direct result of also the Darfur War itself. Like these are the outcomes. Like I always tell people, like older people remember back in the 2000s, there was this huge campaign of Save Darfur.
Yeah, there was. It was a big thing. Hey, I wasn't there. I was 3 years old, but because I'm a historian, I know it was a big thing. It was a big thing.
Huge.
It was big.
Yeah.
CNN was covering it. Jeff Koinange was in CNN at that time. I know he was covering it like crazy. It was big. It was big.
Yeah. And then people wonder what happened to that campaign and what happened to Save Darfur and everything.
Yeah.
And the answer is simple, that the Janjaweed won that war.
Oh.
Bashir and the Janjaweed won that war. And that's how you got the RSF.
Damn.
So the RSF is kind of the crowning of Bashir, of like getting away with a genocide like that. So you have the South Sudan war. South Sudan is gone. You have the Darfur war. And now you have the RSF doing whatever they want around Sudan. that kind of led to the December Revolution in 2018 and 2019 because of this insanity.
Yes.
So the revolution was kind of started as an accumulation of civic resistance, of armed resistance, of all of these, student movement, the unions,
the women also,
the women movement, huge over there. So all of these things kind of culminated into this moment of removing Bashir. Now, the sad part comes in where there was a period, that period of 2018 and 2019 was a period of huge optimism.
In Sudan,
but in the region also. Because in 2018, for the first time in decades, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia make peace and start agreeing on a common, not only just non-aggression, no, development and cooperation and stuff like that.
Okay.
You have in Sudan this huge movement. We got rid of Bashir. So in normal circumstances, you should think okay, so we got it. We as Africans in that area, we got it. We're moving forward. It's a new day, all of that. Didn't quite go that way. The reason it doesn't go that way is this map right here.
Let's go.
This is a study done by something called the United States Institute of Peace.
Okay.
I've been there a few times, but this was a think tank that they brought together. The U.S. Institute of Peace brought together a lot of former ambassadors who got together for a workshop a few days, and they put out this report. They call this the Red Sea Arena. We said earlier that the Red Sea, how crucial it is and how critical it is
to the world economy.
Imperial forces look at this region using this map.
Okay.
So for them, they're looking at the Red Sea. And what are the countries that affect the Red Sea? And of course, Israel being right here at the tip of the Red Sea. So if you notice, Gulf countries, you have the African countries that are right on the Red Sea. So you have Egypt, you have Sudan, you have Eritrea, Djibouti, and Somalia. You would think that that's it. As far as the Red Sea arena, that's it. But you're including South Sudan, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda.
Yeah.
So if this is a think tank that's right there in Washington, D.C., and these are decision makers, and they're telling us this is how we look at this region as one block. The implication is that there's no such thing as 100% sovereignty in these countries that's going to be allowable to them. Complete sovereignty and independence for any of these countries is a red line for them. So what does that mean? That means if 3 of the biggest countries create an alliance in 2018 and a peace deal, because a country like Eritrea will tell them, both Ethiopia and Somalia, hey, we can get together and we can make a peace deal and everything will be beautiful. But we're not taking any orders from any imperial powers.
Okay.
Or any other country. That has to be the rule.
Okay.
Somalia and Ethiopia, we're cool with that. Another thing is that for Sudan, that December revolution was not wanted by the West at all. For them, they saw Bashir as already capitulated, already cooperated on overthrowing Gaddafi in Libya, already cooperated on the Yemen war, already cooperated on these things. He's our guy, let him stay. That's when you started getting destabilization across the board, not just Sudan, Ethiopia as well.
with Tigray.
Yes.
I remember that.
Egypt works more. Let me just change this a little bit. So we fast forward to today.
Okay.
We have a policy kind of destabilization in the region. Ethiopia refused to take any orders from Trump in his first administration. They refused to back down on capitulating to Egypt on the GERD dam. As a result, November 4th, 2020, as soon as Biden won the presidency, the TPLF started attacking Addis and Asmara at the same time. So to us, it was very weird. Like, how can a movement start attacking two countries at the same time? Who's behind them? Before that, by 2 weeks, Trump was on a phone call with like Hamdok and Burhan and these guys. And he was basically telling them that you have to talk to Ethiopia. Because if you don't talk to Ethiopia, the Egyptians are going to blow up the dam. 2 weeks after that, TPLF went in and they started their war, attacking both Addis and Asmara. Sudan, once Bashir was removed and the transitional government came in, the US started making some weird demands.
Which are?
They said, first of all, you guys have to pay for the bombings of the US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania.
Whoa. Wait.
Okay, we can come down and sit down for this one.
Wait. Let's stay there. Just stay there. What the hell did you just say? You remember, it was in 98, right? The bomb blasts in the US embassies in Nairobi and in Dar es Salaam. Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. What do you mean? Like the way you just, the way you just said it is like, explain it. What do you mean by that?
So they're basically saying that the responsibility of governments carries on whether that government is still there or not. They become a burden on the state itself. I told you, like, Bin Laden was here in Sudan, like in the 90s.
Yeah, you told me that.
Right? But by 98, there wasn't a Bin Laden. It's a way to pressure the transitional government by making them responsible for Khartoum kind of being a hub for terrorists back in the 90s. The USS Cole was blown up in 2000 in the Red Sea. Sudan also had to pay for that. They're telling the transitional government, you guys have to pay this money, or we're not lifting sanctions and we're not doing anything. A lot of the politicians tried to explain to them, like, listen, the guy that was actually doing that, we removed him. He's not there anymore. We took him out. His political party is illegal now. It's supposed to be disbanded. Why do we have to pay this money? Again, it had nothing to do with compensation. It had nothing to do with terrorism or any of that. It's a way to pressure that transitional government and have leverage over that government and muscle them into following certain policies. Now, what was the main policy that they wanted from the transitional government? Normalization with Israel.
Okay.
You have to normalize your relationship with Israel. You have to open an Israeli embassy in Khartoum. You have to have a Sudanese embassy in Israel. And now you're part of the Zionist family. The Abraham Accords.
Yeah.
Those Abraham Accords, they pressured Sudan to get into the Abraham Accords. Both Hemeti and Burhan were 100% fine with normalizing with Israel.
Okay.
It was the civilians who refused.
And why is that?
The civilians understood that if you normalize with Israel, under these Abraham Accords, you are going to be under the direct, authority of two of the most right-wing governments that have ever came to either the US or Israel. And not only that, the escalation that's been happening from the Israelis leading up to what we're seeing right now in the Iran war has been brewing for decades. So you had to understand that, okay, since you had the war on terror, since 9/11, it was clear that the US and Israel are on a rampage to get rid of Libya, to get rid of Syria, to get rid of Iraq, to get rid of Yemen, to mess with Lebanon, to further colonize the Palestinians. Like they're on an upward escalatory trajectory since 9/11. You have to look at it for that whole time period. That the neocon plan to actually take over the Middle East, either control it or destroy it. That they're now including Sudan as part of that equation. Sudan has always been on the margins of the Middle East, but now it became imperative for them to squeeze Sudan into the Middle East and squeeze it into the countries that are with the Zionist normalization. Egypt already normalized with Israel, since the Camp David. I'm not Camp David. I mean with Sadat in the 70s. Eritrea and Ethiopia, they don't really have a big problem with Israel. It's not really an issue for them. The biggest issues for them for this Red Sea thing is Sudan and Egypt. And Egypt already normalized a long time ago. For them, they want Sudan to be part of that normalization.
Just if we go to a detour, Somaliland and Israel.
There you go. You see that? So Somalians are very clear about them not wanting to have anything to do with the Zionist entity. So then you have to create some creases within the country and recognize it in order to destabilize the country a little bit more. But the Somali destabilization was before that. Especially, 2006 was kind of the breaking point for that. So when you start looking at it, it's like, okay, you have countries that right now, a snapshot right now, that are completely destabilized. Sudan is completely destabilized. The Democratic Republic of Congo is destabilized. Ethiopia has 5 different rebel groups that are at war with the government. Somalia is going through a tough time between the Somalilanders and the Shabab in the south and all this kind of stuff. So then you start looking at it and you're like, okay, well, what's driving this? Why do we have such a hard time with stabilization? And once you start zooming out, you start understanding that it's by design.
It's by design.
Once countries start talking about their sovereignty and start taking control of their own destiny and start controlling their resources and start looking at it, especially now that you have things like BRICS, for example.
Yes.
Where you have an alternative. This isn't the unipolar moment anymore. Now all of these countries can completely and 100% rely on the BRICS countries without needing a single penny from the West. We're at that point in history right now. So that's why I think for them it became imperative that if they can't control the country, then they don't want it to be a beacon for sovereignty and for uniting and working with other African countries. So they would rather destabilize the country rather than it being an anti-imperialist country. And that's kind of the main issue why they were pressing on the Abraham Accords and paying all these hundreds of millions of dollars in, compensation, which we didn't really, have anything to do with.